So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this webinar where we will take a close look at the findings from the recent report Lighting the Path by the International Institute for Sustainable Development. My name is Maria Alegre from the European Climate Foundation, and within the International Energy Program, I lead the Data into Action work. I'll be moderating the discussion today, and please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted into the IISD website. So in the next 90 minutes, we will hear from Olivier Bois von Kursk, lead author of the report, who will present the main findings, followed by a panel discussion with Catherine Abreu, founder and executive director of Destination Zero, a new organization focusing on building community for fossil-free future, and Lucie Pinson, founder and director of Reclaim Finance, whose vision is of a financial sector that supports the transition to sustainable societies that preserve ecosystems and satisfy people's basic needs. We'll have 25 minutes after their presentations for Q&A from all of you. And for that, I will encourage you to please use the Q&A box. And well, before I give the floor to Olivier, I'd like to stress how much I welcome a report like this. There are plenty of scientific findings, and there's quite a lot of data on climate change. And we always need more, better, and more transparent and more accessible data, of course, but we also need to understand what the science and the data are telling us, what they mean for the world, for a region, and for each country. So translating charts and figures into insights, messages, and narratives is absolutely fundamental to make informed policy and investment decisions to drive an efficient and effective transition. So Olivier, thank you very much for your work, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maria. So let me share my screen now for my presentation. So are you seeing my screen now? Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. So thank you again so much, Maria, for being here today and for moderating this webinar. And we're very grateful at IISD to be for the support IISD provided for this important work. And I'm also very pleased to be presenting this report analysis in company of Catherine and Lucie. We're two extremely talented and dedicated women who successfully led many campaigns to fruition. So it's a real honor to be here with you today. And so today in my presentation, I'm going to speak about our finding from this new IISD study, which analyzed, as Maria just said, the IPCC mitigation pathways that were just published in April. So this analysis we've conducted is based on the energy pathway that's published alongside the IPCC Working Group 3 report. And so in this presentation, I'll try to show what does a decarbonized energy sector looks like, while focusing specifically on oil and gas production, wind and solar deployment, and investment needs. So actually, one of the most important conclusions highlighted in the report is that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires global greenhouse gas emission to reduce by about 50% in 2030 and reach net zero CO2 emission by the middle of the century. And this is simply because there is very limited disposal space for carbon emission in the atmosphere left to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we have just about 8 years of current level of greenhouse gas emission to before we exhaust the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we've assessed the 1.5 degree compatible energy system by digging in for more details from the IPCC scenario in order to extract the policy relevant recommendations. So the energy pathways are basically a description of the future of the energy system over the coming decades. So they're generated by using integrated assessment models, which are computer model of the whole energy system. And these models use a range of different assumption mechanisms to answer multiple different questions. And so there were actually more than 1,000 of these scenarios published in the IPCC database, and only about 100 that actually limits warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no low overshoot. So our analysis that we published is based on a subset of these 1.5 degree pathways that have particularly relevance for policy recommendations. So the objective of this presentation are first to show our methodology for selecting scenarios, and then to present the oil and gas production phase-out pathway that are consistent with them. So I will then also show the implication of these pathways for gas power generation, and for solar capacity deployment, as well as the consistent investment need. So first of all, one of the biggest challenge to the achievability of the Paris goal identified by the IPCC is the overwhelming use of unproven technologies to capture and store carbon emissions. So over-relying on this technology could impose significant risks of irreversible climate change if they're unsuccessfully implemented. And as I just mentioned before, the IPCC Working Group 3 consider only about 100 scenario limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But many of these pathways actually include very high level of carbon sequestration method in order to reach net zero by 2050, and then to stabilize climate to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. So actually, IPCC also published a set of feasibility and sustainability dimension for this method. And considering the risk associated with them, which I'll get to in just a moment, we've applied this threshold to select pathways that are consistent with the IPCC's own assessment of the feasibility and sustainability of these sequestration method. And then we've employed these subset of pathway to inform the rest of our analysis. So first of all, carbon capture and storage used in the oil and gas production and linked to power plant still remain very much in their infancy as a technology. They have not been demonstrated at scale yet, and they remain highly expensive. And actually the current sequestration capacity from installed CCS plants today is only about 50 million tons per year. So that's 50 megaton compared to the 3 billion ton as shown in the threshold in the table here. And actually, like most of the installed capacity today is actually used for enhanced oil recovery, which is basically a process of injecting the captured CO2 back into the oil well in order to increase reservoir pressure and extract more oil. Hence, the 3 gigaton per year of sequestration threshold imposed in our analysis remain still a very high level of deployment for this technology. And another carbon dioxide removal technology that is overwhelmingly employed in models is bioenergy that is combined with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. So this technology actually requires a large amount of agricultural land to grow biocrops that is actually destined to be combusted for energy, while the resulting emissions are then captured and stored underground in deep geological formation. So the IPCC actually clearly states in the latest report that over-reliance on this technology can impose significant risk for food security, biodiversity, and land rights just because of the sheer requirement of land use it needs. And finally, the carbon sink from afforestation and reforestation can be a great mitigation option if done appropriately, but there's only so much land available to be used for reforestation globally. And depending on the location and types of project, then tree planting could also pose significant risk for biodiversity. It can stress local water reserves and also compete with other land uses. So therefore, in our analysis, we filtered out the scenario that have level of fossil CCS and BECCS that are above sequestration threshold showed in this table. And then we also limited the deployment of afforestation and reforestation to what is the maximum of the sustainable range that's shown in the IPCC reports. So accordingly, out of the 100 scenarios that are published in Working Group 3 that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, our analysis focuses on a subset of 26 pathways that are consistent with feasible and sustainable deployment of carbon sequestration method. So I'll then refer to these pathway as feasible 1.5 degree pathway. So that's also how we sort of christen these 26 pathway in our report. However, we're well aware that there's many other feasibility dimensions assessed by the IPCC, and we focus on CDR and CCS just because they're highlighted as posing a particular risk to the achievability of the Paris goal, and they've also attracted a lot of concern from policymakers and investors alike. And actually, the assumption made on CDR and CCS is also, well, changes a lot the amount of oil and gas production consumption in pathways. So this is where I want to get to here. So this slide actually shows the median estimate for global oil and gas production and consumption from these 26 pathways. So we've expressed the production in terms of the carbon dioxide emission that fossil fuel generates when combusted. So we can see from this slide that the production of oil and gas that's consistent with these selected 1.5 degree pathway actually needs to reduce by 30% already by 2030, so in just about 8 years. So the next slide shows here the total embodied emission from the oil and gas production that is expected to be generated from the fields that are already producing or the ones that are under development. So we can see from the superimposition that these fields by themselves already fully exhaust the amount that the world can consume to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this data is taken from Rystad Energy. And so then we can see in this slide that the emission that would be emitted from new fields and exploration of licensed resource will all be in excess of what 1.5 degree pathway indicate that we can produce. So therefore, if the industry continue to produce new fields, then this can either push the world beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius or generate a large number of stranded assets if government later decide to enforce more stringent climate policy to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So therefore, we conclude that there should be no new oil and gas fields developed in 1.5 degree pathways. And this is also the same conclusion that is shared by the International Energy Agency net zero emission pathway that was published just at the end of last year. So actually, I showed this this pathway here for oil and gas in the IISD case, and it also shows that there's no room for new oil and gas development or any new fields if we're to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So moreover, the two IPCC illustrative mitigation pathways that are highlighted in the Working Group 3 report, also, well, the two that focuses on energy sector transition also arrive at the same conclusion. So we show very steep decline of oil and gas production over the coming decades. And actually in all sensible 1.5 degree pathway, this is quite of a common conclusion, pointing to the need that we need to end new development of fossil fuel resources. So now I'd like to turn to another conclusion taken from our scenario analysis, which concerns the use of gas in the power sector. So while it's often argued, especially these days, that gas can be, at least in some parts of the circle, that gas can be transition fuel, the IPCC data clearly show that unabated gas power generation need to be almost entirely phased out by 2040 already for it to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So since we only have about 18 years to virtually phase out all unabated gas power plants, and considering that new plants typically last for about 30 to 40 years, then this implies that there's no room to build any new unabated gas power plants worldwide. Anyhow, the alternative to gas in the power sector are already highly cost competitive, and the costs are continuing to fall, and especially with the very high gas prices today, the competitiveness is even higher. So this brings me to turn of how can we replace the oil and gas in the energy system. So it won't surprise anyone here in this call, I think, that the answer is mainly through wind and solar. So the IPCC report, the Working Group 3 report released in April actually states that wind and solar can generate the highest mitigation, have the highest mitigation potential and at the cheapest cost by far from all other mitigation technologies. And this graph actually shows the annual wind capacity installation. So the blue line on top shows the median of the same 26 IPCC pathway that we selected from our analysis. And the blue area below is the forecasted annual installation under current policies and current project pipeline as measured by Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And actually, Bloomberg is actually one of the most optimistic group accounting for forecast of new deployment. So this is not a conservative measure necessarily. But nevertheless, we showed that the blue line that shows the wind capacity in our 1.5 degree pathways show that we need to increase capacity addition by about 20% every year, and that's for the rest of the decade. So 20% increase per year, every year, until 2030. And actually, by 2030, the annual capacity addition reaches about twice the amount that is forecasted to be delivered with actual policy in place. So the implication here is that we need a lot more policy support compared to what current policy states in order to significantly scale up the rate of deployment, which actually needs to double in speed. So this finding is also consistent with the IEA assessment of the wind capacity requirement that are necessary to displace oil and gas and stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And other IPCC pathway actually also indicate that we might need actually even more capacity deployment if we are to stay within a 1.5 degree temperature limit in a transformed energy system. And actually the deployment for solar capacity is roughly the same. So it shows that we need also about 20% annual growth per year until 2030 in order to displace the oil and gas production that needs to phase out quite rapidly. And the total growth is about 50% higher than what would be expected under current policies. So we've also performed a sensitivity analysis for solar deployment, and shows that this is very consistent with what the IEA has found in terms of solar deployment. And actually other IPCC mitigation pathways show that we might need potentially several order of magnitude more deployment if we are to transform the energy system to one that stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So now I'd like to turn to the investment needs that are consistent with these pathways. So I think it's already well understood that a very large amount of capital will be needed to finance this energy transition. And this graph shows the annual investment needs that are consistent with the SS 1.5 degree pathways in our Lighting the Path report, but only for wind and solar deployment. So we show that actually annual investment grows to just above 800 billion per year for wind and solar combined. But based on current projection and expected investment level, we can only expect about half of this amount to be delivered. So therefore, we have an investment gap that's about 450 billion annually for wind and solar by 2030. But the good news, actually, if I may say, in the story is that this investment gap is actually smaller than the amount that is expected to be spent on new oil and gas field. And as we've seen, these are all in excess of what would be consistent with 1.5 degree pathways. So as the IPCC says, and I'm quoting here, like there's no shortage of money globally. It's simply that it has yet to travel to where it's most needed. And I think that this figure exemplifies this statement quite well. So this actually leads me to my conclusions and key messages already, which are that under 1.5 degree pathways, global oil and gas production needs to decrease quite rapidly and reach 30% reduction in about 8 years and 65% reduction by 2050, by the middle of the century. So this leaves absolutely no room for new oil and gas development and new exploration. Otherwise, in terms of unabated gas power plants, 1.5 degree pathways clearly illustrate that there's no room to build any new unabated gas power plant unless they're built with CCS capacity from the get-go, but this is very expensive and hasn't been really demonstrated at scale. And globally, we actually need to phase out gas power generation from unabated power plants by 2040 already. And otherwise, the energy transition that's consistent with 1.5 degree pathways show not only from IPCC pathway, but also IEA and others that we need to double the rate of deployment of wind and solar globally. So that is equivalent to about a 20% increase per year every year until then. And that requires significantly scaling up investment flows towards these technologies. And actually, there's a 450 billion investment gap for annual investment in these technologies. So on that, I'd like to thank you all for joining this webinar, and also mention that this Lighting the Path report is published in the beginning of June, is actually a staple for a larger report that we plan to publish in just before the COP27. So we'll actually look at other scenarios in this new report. We'll look at oil and gas production, renewable energy deployment, both for IEA, ARENA, but also the One Earth model, and also other DNV and other consultancy scenarios, and then perform a similar type of analysis, but that will be much more comprehensive with other deep dive into other avenues for mitigating emission globally. So thank you so much for listening, and on this I will pass back the mic to Maria.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Olivier. And now we are on to Catherine, who will discuss with us implications of oil and gas phase-out timelines for government policies and ambition levels.
Great, thanks so much, Maria, and Olivier, thanks for your great presentation. So critical to have these reminders of what the science is telling us we need to do to confront the climate crisis. I'm seeing lots of requests in the chat for a link to the report so that folks can dig in deeper, so we'll be sure to provide that. And a reminder to folks as well that if you have questions, we're making use of the Q&A box, which you'll find just toward the bottom of your screen. So you can type questions in there and we'll answer them later, or we can even answer them in real time over typing. All right, so here we are. Olivia just told us that by 2040, so that's in 18 years, gas plants, unabated gas plants need to be pretty much phased out. And yet, given the current geopolitical context, we are unfortunately seeing a huge rush to develop and further expand gas production globally in order to displace Russian gas in light of Putin's war in Ukraine. This despite the fact that we saw earlier in the spring, the EU present its Repower EU plan, which talked a whole lot about increasing the use of renewable energy and energy efficiency in the region. We are still seeing this huge reliance on gas and a rush now to invest in further gas expansion to displace gas supplies from Russia, rather than a rush to expand renewable energy and energy efficiency to the scale that's required to displace those gas assets. So what does this look like? It looks like the first LNG facility in the United States receiving a permit to start processing in the last 5 years, receiving that permit in recent months. It looks like coal exports even on the rise in the midst of this energy crisis, even coal from Russia. And we're seeing coal plants being reopened in Germany and France and other parts of the world. Here in Canada, we of course aren't immune. I know many of us on the line, good to see some familiar folks here, have been tracking the calls for Canada to somehow be a part of relieving Europe of its addiction to Russian gas by displacing it with Canadian gas, despite the fact that anything being built here in Canada is unlikely to get built in a timeline that actually will serve that purpose. And that was, of course, a part of the underlying justification for the approval of the Bay du Nord project here in Canada off the East Coast recently. We are seeing this conversation outside of Canada and the US as well, in parts of Latin America, including Mexico, and a big region where this conversation is taking place and where there's a big push for gas expansion is in Africa, with Germany and Italy in particular being some pretty nasty culprits of going to African countries to forge ties and develop new LNG projects. And we are hearing from many of these countries, yes, an interest in the potential economic development opportunities that might come with these fossil fuel projects, as well as a calling out of the hypocrisy of countries of the global north who've been talking a big talk on the need to address climate change while continuing to produce oil and gas themselves, and while telling developing countries in the global south that they shouldn't be developing their oil and gas reserves, and now coming to those same countries to say, hey, can you please develop your gas reserves to get us out of the mess that we're in? Fortunately, some really effective pushback has been coming, a pushback to this expansion rush has been coming from great thinkers and activists and communities around the world. Would highly recommend this piece from my colleague Mohammed Adaw, who has been doing some really good work talking about the fact that there's a huge risk of stranded assets in Africa if countries invest in building new projects there that have these incredibly long life spans. So, the conversation might be about a short-term crunch to address the existing energy crisis that is being worsened by Putin's war in Ukraine. But what about the long-term implications of opening up these new fields and building these new pieces of infrastructure that generally have a lifespan of multiple decades? And there's plenty of work going on to remind European governments that they can fully move away from Russian gas dependence by 2025 with the almost exclusive use of renewable energy and energy efficiency, and making use of slight production increases in existing fields to fill those short-term availability crunches. And so there really is, as many modelers in the world have been saying, not a need for this huge new swath of projects that are being proposed. And the messages are mixed, right? So we saw this big dialogue opening up between the United States and Europe on energy cooperation in light of the current energy crisis. Much of that did revolve around the US's very clear interest in expanding its ability to provide LNG, liquefied natural gas, to Europe. But part of that conversation also involves increased cooperation on energy efficiency and clean electricity. And in fact, we recently saw the Biden administration launch a novel use of its Defense Production Act to, for the first time, funnel money through the Department of Energy to boost things like solar panel and heat pump manufacturing. Unfortunately, that Defense Production Act will have probably some significant implications for the domestic market in the US, but is unlikely to really affect trade with the EU, which is, again, very much going down the line of further gas development. And so for me, this leaves open a real question of, well, what does international cooperation between countries on renewable energy and energy efficiency rather than fossil fuels look like? And part of the answer to that question is, well, it has to look equitable. It has to take into account the historic responsibilities and the historic contributions of countries to the global climate crisis. And there have been a number of reports in the last couple of years that have tried to think through what a fair phase out of oil and gas production, of fossil fuel production, looks like between countries. So taking into account that countries in the global north that have been taking up an unfair share of the global atmosphere by producing their oil and gas and their fossil fuels and coal as well for decades, that those countries need to be on the vanguard of phasing out that production, while leaving a little bit more space for producing countries in the global south. But that space is actually quite limited. So part of what these reports are saying is that significant support needs to be flowing to countries in the global south to help with that just transition away from fossil fuel production, as well as support the transition to renewables, and to make sure that economies that are trying to provide energy access and meet their development needs can do so without the use of fossil fuels. So quickly, I think it's probably useful for us to take a look at what's standing in the way of this transition to renewable energy that we know is required. This is a report, again, coming out of the US, that I found really useful to take a look at kind of current market trends. It is zeroed in on one country, but I think many of the lessons that this report took away are applicable in other parts of the world as well. It's not that the cost of renewable energy is prohibitive. In fact, the cost of renewables, as many of us will know, has been falling much faster than anyone predicted in the last couple of decades. And so we now see that wind and solar are competitively priced in most parts of the world, including here in North America and in the United States. It's also not the fact that nobody's interested in buying renewable power. So in the US, we're seeing that most of the new power purchase agreements that are being signed do to some extent include power purchase agreements to purchase renewable energy where it is available. So if it's not price and if it's not market interest in the product, then what is it? Well, A big part of it is these kinds of delays that are being caused by supply chain issues. The cost of steel to make wind turbines, for instance, has increased by 40% in the last number of months as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine, or Putin's war in Ukraine. But on the ground in countries, there's also a series of regulatory and governance hurdles that renewable energy projects are facing. And this is a really critical one, even though it's kind of unsexy to talk about, a huge decades-long underinvestment in electricity grids. That means there are huge interconnection queues that renewable energy and other energy projects are backed up in, trying to gain access to an antiquated grid that hasn't had enough investments in it to modernize it and prepare it for a renewable energy conservation, demand responsive grid of the 21st century. And indeed, we see that here in the US, and this is very much true in Canada and many other parts of the world, the transmission being brought online, so the ability to move electricity from one market to another, is incredibly slow, and it is not ramping up at the speed that's required to bring all of these renewables online, because we know that we need to be able to balance renewable energy across regions differently than we do with fossil fuel-based electricity production. So how do we get over these get over these hurdles, I should say, ideas? There are many other organizations and think tanks out there who put forward great policy recommendations for getting past these hurdles, but I think the Secretary General has done a good job here of summarizing the 5 things we need to be doing. First, we need to be making renewable energy technology a public good. The fact that there are patents and the inability to, really alleviate roadblocks when it comes to knowledge sharing and technology transfer, we need to be moving away from that, and particularly when it comes to battery storage, because we're seeing that the renewable energy projects that do the best are those that combine generation with battery storage, those hybrid projects. We need to be improving global access to components and raw materials. So that means on a global level, thinking through those supply chain issues, which will only continue as we continue to experience the ramp up of conflict and climate impacts. We need to level the playing field for renewable energy technologies, and this is where a lot of the policy and regulatory measures come in. So this is about setting renewable energy targets, putting those in countries' Paris Agreement pledges into our nationally determined contributions. Those policies and regulatory measures, as Olivier was saying, need to increase the share of renewable energies from 29% to 60% over the course of the next 8 years if we want to hold to a 1.5 degree compatible pathway. So there's big work cut out for us there. Shifting energy subsidies from fossil fuels to renewables is a huge part of this task, again, as Olivier mentioned, and I think Lucy will talk about a little bit more. Tons of public money is being dumped into fossil fuels right now, and that money needs to be transferred to renewable energy. And that has huge potential, because we know that the amount of money that's required by renewable energy, the amount of investment, is about 4 trillion. So the subsidies that are already being poured into fossil fuels are relatively equivalent to the amount of investment that's needed for renewables. Of course, that transfer is never going to be one-to-one, but we know that it's possible. The resources are out there. It's really an allocation issue. So those are some quick some points, and I'll leave it there for Lucy. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much. Now, please, before we proceed with Lucy, please remember to share your questions with us in the Q&A box. We only have 4 at the moment, so please, I encourage you to ask questions or add comments there. Thank you. Okay, so Lucy, please, could you please tell us about the implications of the IPCC pathways for financial institutions' net zero targets and investment decisions? Thank you.
I'm ready. Hello, everyone, and thanks Olivier and IISD for the invitations. Thanks for sharing my slide, Olivier. So my name is Lucy. I'm the founder and executive director of Reclaim Finance. Maybe because we have a very young organization, I will just start with a very brief presentation of who we are. We are a research and campaigning NGO funded 2 years ago, so we are 2 years old. We are affiliated with Friends of the Earth Grants, and we do cover all financial institutions with the objectives of making work for the climate and transition towards sustainable societies. Slide, please. We can switch to the number 2 already. The next one. Thank you. So obviously our final targets are the banks, insurers and reinsurers and investors, and how they do invest into and finance the world around us with a specific focus on the energy sector. But to do so, we also have a look at the decision being made by governments or regulatory agencies, mostly in France and at the EU level. And we do from time to time now on an opportunistic basis, but we would like to amplify that to also tackle the role of what I like to call the hidden player of the financial industry. So the rating agency, the voting agencies, the brokers, the index providers, or other players that are not elected but do play a very important role in influencing the way financial institutions work. For example, it's PTI or other investors coalition and network. Next slide, please. So to go back to the topic, first of all, some introductory remarks. First of all, the hypothesis that we will make here is that we are speaking about financial institutions that have committed to align with 1.5 and with net zero targets. And indeed, hundreds of financial institutions represented around 40% of the all global private assets have committed to such targets while joining GFAN's Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So many do feel committed to meet these targets, but the bad news is that many more don't feel committed at all to meet these targets. And all or almost all don't know what it means to meet this target and what needs to be done if they are really serious about meeting the targets. So what many especially don't have in mind is that they committed when joining GFANs to reduce by 50% their emissions by 2030, and Olivier spoke about it. So 50% reductions by 2030 is also a key characteristic in the IPCC latest report of 1.5 no or limited overshoot pathways. So knowing that many financial institutions and a growing number of them are committing to do that, to halve their emissions by 2030, the big questions remain: how to do so and what scenario to use. Next slide. So the big question is, what kind of scenario so the first things to know is that there's a battle to be fought on what kind of scenario financial institutions are going to use to define their targets to meet their net zero pledge, and how great is a IISD report. It's not going to be good enough to push some of them and convince them to use low or no overshoot scenarios with a limited reliance on CDR. However, both GFANs and Race to Zero do support the use of pathway with no or low overshoot. But as Olivier said, the IPCC report a lot, like close to 100 scenarios aiming at 1.5 with no or low overshoot. But the number of scenarios using only with limited use of CDR assumption is there is a minimal, I mean, maybe less scenario. And that's the goodness of what the IPCC report is, that it enables us and the financial institutions to define what the limited CDR will mean, and to build on the IPCC own assessment of CDR to establish what level could be feasible, and also with clear implication on what it means for fossil fuels pathway. However, the bad news is that even if GIF and RTZ push financial institutions to use scenarios with no or low overshoot, none of the current alliance guidelines explicitly rule out scenarios with IBEX, and so by implication, they don't explicitly rule out high amounts of negative emissions. Yet, what we can say today is that there is one alliance, the AOA, that did mandated a scenario called the One Earth climate model, which is low and no overshoot and only has negative emissions from land use, and only to neutralize industrial process emission, mainly cement. We also see that the RTZ, the race to zero, even if they are very biblical on negative emissions, leaving a lot of space for interpretation, we can still point out as NGO and other civil society organizations involved in pushing for high ambition on climate action, we can point out to language which says that the definition of net zero means immediate reductions down to a minimal residual level of emissions, and that says that residual emissions should be neutralized by permanent removal. Also, the SBTi says that in most cases, residual emissions should be assumed to only be final 10% of the emissions. So there is a strong implication that the 50% reductions target means absolute reductions and no removal. And this will support that the financial institutions that are committed to net zero could build their own strategy on the IISD report and findings, or on the One Earth climate model supported by the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. So now that is being said, let's assume that financial institutions are very serious about using this type of scenario, but going deeper into the energy sector, what should it mean, particularly for the support to the oil and gas sector that Olivier also talked about, presenting specific pathway for this sector. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the first thing, I will build on the three main conclusions mentioned by Olivier, that production needs to decline by 30% by 2030, but there is no room for any new oil and gas fields, and also that some fields already in operation may also need to be retired early. So first of all, no new expansion. There is no room for any new oil and gas fields, and that Olivier said it's been very clearly said in the IISD report. It was clearly said in the IES scenario. So financial institutions should not finance new fields. That's clear. And it should mean, obviously, ending project finance and insurance coverage or equity investment for such projects. Yet, even if they do that, it will not be enough to align the financial services with 1.5 and with the 50% target by 2030. It won't be enough, especially for banks, because most financing comes from corporate finance. So banks and investors should stop providing non-dedicated corporate support to companies developing new fields. But that being said, it's also a little bit tricky to do so, especially for the oil and gas sector, which is much more complex than the coal sector. If you look at what has been done by many financial institutions for the coal industry, many of them did adopted policies with different criteria based on engagement and exclusion. On exclusion, they were excluding companies because of their high exposure to the coal sector, but they also started from 2017 to draw a red line against expansion, building on climate science and on the fact that there was no space already for new coal plants. So they were excluding all companies that were listed in the global coal exit list being done by Urgewald as a company which is expanding in the coal sector. And that was, even if many financial institutions will still need to do so, the US, Japanese financial institutions, many of them did excluded these companies. And it was doable because it's around 50% of the companies that are being active in the coal sector. But if you look at the oil and gas sector, if you do want to be very strict on climate science and say, I don't provide corporate financing to companies that do build new oil and gas fields, because these fields are inconsistent with the remaining carbon budget, there is no room for that, so they are a direct threat to climate targets. We will exclude 96% of the existing companies operating in the oil and gas industry as producers. And obviously that's impossible to do so because we will still need to, even if we need to organize from now on or phase out of the industry, we cannot exclude and divest from all companies overnight. So that means that we need to be much more clever about how do we approach that. The good news in that, first of all, is that there is a great trend popping up in France with now 9 financial institutions that have taken steps toward ending expansions in the past weeks. How they do that? First of all, financial institutions need to first ask for the end of expansion. It might seem very silly to say that, asking for the end of expansion, but a research that we led on the top 30 asset manager operating in Europe shows that none requires the investee companies to stop expanding, and none of them ask their investee companies to adopt a phase out strategy or to even reduce production. It might be part of a nice tea discussion during their engagement, but it's not a clear demand part of their engagement or investment policy. So that's really need to change. The second thing is that they need to set a clear deadline. Asking for the end of expansion will be good, but to be serious, to be seen as a serious, to make it seem as a serious demand, it's very important that investors set a deadline to have a time-bound demand to stop expansion. And then they must be ready to exclude these companies. So they need to exclude companies that will fail ending support, the development of new oil and gas fields. So expansion, in short, must become the litmus test for the credibility of transition plans from oil and gas companies. In the meantime, before excluding these companies, escalation is possible. You can increase, as a financial institution, they can increase the price of credits, of capital, to increase the price of capital and deter in companies from moving ahead with these plans, but they could also take action as a shareholders when they are investing in these companies and vote against the board at the AGM season, one time, second time, and after they can divest, just to send a very clear signal that they are very serious about these demands. Unfortunately, we are very far from that. If you followed a little bit the latest AGM season, you would have seen that all the say on climate that were filed by and presented to a shareholder votes by the management of the main oil and gas majors, BP, Shell, Chevron, Total Energy. They were all supported by their shareholders, and they all got around 95% of support, despite the fact that they were incomplete and despite the fact that these companies are not aligned and are not on track to be aligned with 1.5, considering they are in the top 10 or 15 companies worldwide developing the most new oil and gas projects. So voting might be very important. And above all, one thing which is really, really important in the meantime, because you start understanding here that what I'm saying, it's already a confession that we will not align immediately with what climate science is telling us, because it means that we will not divest, or that there is work to be done to push a company to stop expanding, while science will say that we should have stopped expanding already yesterday, a few months ago. So what is really important for investors is already to stop investing in these companies, stop making new investments. They can keep their existing assets to vote during AGM season, to engage, but we need to make clear that any new bonds which is being bought for these companies is gonna be used for the overall expansion plan of these companies, and might use it for renewable energy. But considering most of the capex is being driven to oil and gas, new investment today are in support of the expansion, and it's clearly a sign that when investors are talking about engagement and supporting the transition of their investee company, if they are still making new investment into these companies, that's just greenwashing. And finally, obviously, there is no need to say, I just mentioned, and just maybe as a good news is that when I say that we have policies arriving now, taking a red line against expansion, some of these policies are about ending making no new investment into expansionists, and engaging with them, voting against them during AGM season. So we see these kind of good practices popping up, and we need to obviously speed it up. Finally, obviously, I mentioned only here the upstream side, but Olivier made it very clear that we also need to act on the power sector. And obviously, it will be very important for the financial institutions to also consider other issues when assessing the transition of their companies, and especially if they are building assets that will need to be closed in 18 years in the best case scenario for the gas power plants. And obviously, when we need to stop upstream new oil and gas projects, it means that any kind of company which is still exploring should be put on the watch list and be considered for divestment first. Next slide. Considering that stopping expansion won't be enough, IISD showed many existing fields will have to be closed before the end of their lifetime. So we also need to get financial institutions doing more to support this phase out of the oil and gas industry. So let's start with positive news. I mentioned already earlier the updated race to zero criteria. The updated race to zero criteria could not be clearer this time. Not only signatories as they are being asked to restrict the development and financing and facilitation of new fossil fuel assets, but they are also asked to contribute to phasing down and out all unabated fossil fuels as part of the global just transition. The key word is phasing down and out. They say clearly that the way to go is a full exit from the fossil fuel industry. And one big bank already, Crédit Agricole, we are still very early in the process, but it's quite a positive news. Crédit Agricole, which is the second biggest French bank, says that it will disengage from oil and gas. And this word is very strong. It will disengage from oil and gas in line with defense, a race to zero criteria. So this is quite something, considering most big financial institutions have been opposing since a year in the last year, the IEA conclusions that we need to stop expanding. So that's real, like a change is happening right now. Obviously, it's really like the beginning, but it's quite a good news that we can build on. Now, obviously, everything remains to be done. Financial institutions right now are being mostly asked through the G-funds to adopt decarbonization targets. And in the best case, they might adopt targets on oil and gas, aiming at absolute emissions reductions. That's what Credit Agricole did. But many of them do only adopt targets in intensity value. And beyond the issue of how the targets are being adopted and implemented, it won't definitely be enough to trigger the changes that are required at the company's level. Sector policies to tackle the most polluting sectors are needed. And unfortunately, the things remain to be done. We assess the policies of 369, to be precise, institutions, financial institutions on oil and gas. And we found that only a third of them have a policy on oil and gas. And out of the 30 biggest AM asset managers operating in Europe, which are so supposedly more advanced than their peers at international level, none of them is requiring investees companies to reduce their production. So engagement, which is becoming very trendy against exclusion, needs to be massively reviewed in order to become effective. Too much focus right now is being given on long-term demands and demands that are not important to really bring significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions. For example, many investors that are active through Climate Action 100+ engage our companies on the adoption of net zero target by 2050, or the review of their lobbying practices or governance things, which are very valid part of discussion when engaging a company. The issue here is that even if they do that right, it will not do anything automatically to allow us to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. So what is needed, and I will stop there, is acknowledging that we need to phase out fossil fuels and commit to do so as a financial institutions, sending the signals that we will exclude companies that do not get on track to reduce their production. And if after a specific deadline, we need financial institutions to bring back the discussion with investee company to 2030 criteria rather than 2050. We need them to engage companies on meaningful criteria and assess companies against the right scenario. That's a very, very, very important thing. We see a lot of investors asking their investee company to adopt decarbonization targets against the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement leaves a lot of space for companies to not only not aim at 1.5 but 2 degrees, but also to use the scenarios that they want with a lot of CDR. So clearly that needs to be changed. And we got a couple of one resolution at least filed in France this year, asking a company to disclose a climate plan in order to allow them to assess it against a scenario with no or low overshoot, with no CDR or very low CDR. So clearly the scenarios are being mentioned in the IISD report. And finally, it's very important, as for expansion, to set deadlines to vote against companies that don't get on track, and finally to exclude them.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucie. And okay, we're a bit short of time, so we'll move on to a few questions to engage in discussion before we move to the Q&A that you're filling in the box. I have a question for you, Olivier, and it's how have you considered other feasibility dimensions in your analysis? For example, have you considered the feasibility of wind and solar scale up?
Thank you. Just going to stop sharing the screen here, and yeah, sure. I mean, actually, this is a question we've received from a few few different groups and reviewers as we were building up the report, and actually we decided to filter on CDR and CCS due to the significant concern that we've observed on these technology for the achievability of the Paris Agreement, for food security, land use, etc., as I mentioned in my slides. But in terms of wind and solar development, we see very high scale up in our pathways, and actually the IPCC does indicate some feasibility assessment for wind and solar scale up, but actually these are measured in terms of decadal percentage point increase for their share in the power sector. But the indicator is actually measured in terms of power generation and not in terms of capacity. So we cannot extract the right data from the IPCC database in terms of generation, but only in terms of capacity. But nevertheless, we see that over the years, the rate of deployment of wind and solar capacity have consistently overperformed over what the projection actually delivered or projected, while CDR and CCS have consistently underperformed and have been very slow to deploy compared to what they are anticipated in many models. So actually, there's more than the 20% annual increase that we see in our data, the annual 20% increase every year until 2030 that we showed in the data is actually really consistent with what the IEA assessment shows. And in terms of the capacity addition, it's also what many models prescribe that that would be possible to deploy. So in that sense, we kind of performed that sensitivity analysis in order to show that it would be feasible, and models showed that we can deploy it at this rate.
Great. Thank you. And to see a question for you, how do you think energy scenarios can be used by financial institutions to align their portfolios with the 1.5 pathways?
Sure. So that's really, I mean, the key questions. And obviously, I mentioned already the importance of convincing financial institutions to use such pathway, and especially such pathway with no or very low reliance on CDR. I think what is really important is to push them to assess the companies, to use them to assess the company's transition plan. And here I would like to build on something that happened in France and that I briefly mentioned earlier, the example of the resolution that was filed at TotalEnergies this year to require the companies to disclose climate indicators against a 1.5 scenario with no or low overshoot and low CDR. What happened in France is that, as you might know, a lot of companies, oil and gas majors, and including Total, are consulting their shareholders on a consultative board on their climate plan, on their own climate plan. The issue here is that most of the time their climate plan are very incomplete, first of all, and misaligned with 1.5. So investors, if they really want to make it useful, they need to require the investee company to not only disclose all the information that is needed to assess the strategy, the climate strategy of companies, but they need to make sure that they also assess this information against the right scenario, so against a scenario which will allow the world and also the investors themselves, when they are part of defense, to achieve these 50% reductions by 2030 that they have to do. And what happened in France, and we really see that that's where the debate here is today. Companies, a growing number of companies are committing to net zero. Many oil and gas majors are committing to achieve net zero. Many oil and gas majors are today adopting a climate plan, are adopting decarbonization targets. It might be incomplete, but they are doing it. And many investors are usually asking companies to only adopt targets against the Paris Agreement, which is a big room for action and for picking the scenarios that postpone actions, that allow the opening of new oil and gas fields, etc., and etc. What happened in France that a group of other small investors did file a resolution asking Total to give all this information, but against the right scenario, against credible and robust scenario. Total put pressure on one company, one investor, to push it to withdraw, and conditions for filing in France are very complicated, but in short, pushing a company, an investor, to withdraw by doing that and succeeding in pushing this investor to withdraw, the resolution was cancelled. And one thing, the official story is that, yeah, but Total conceded to give all the information investors were asking to make the say on climate complete, except on the offset. Except on the offset, and especially Total disagree with this part on the scenario. Total agreed to give them information against the Paris Agreement and not against the scenario. So we see the debate moving, and we can expect many more companies to be really ready to answer positively to investors on giving them all the information that they want, but it won't be enough as long as they are the only one choosing which scenarios they are going to use. So investors need to be very clear about that and really understanding the differences between it. So this kind of webinars is very important, and I think we will definitely need to do it again in front of the investment community in order to train them, because many of them are very cynical, but many of them just don't know about it.
Thank you. So we'll start with the questions from the audience. Catherine Abreu had to leave, unfortunately, but she did answer one of the questions in the chat. I'm going to read out loud her answer. And actually, there have been two questions related to what can be done during the energy transition to prevent ecological and social damage from mining the metals necessary for renewable technologies, and well, especially batteries. And a follow-up question is recycling already extracted metals a feasible option? And Catherine answered in writing, and she said, this is an important question. It's critical that we don't replicate the ecologically and socially destructive extractive model of fossil fuels as we ramp up development of renewables. The good news is that the lifespan of renewable energy technology are long and increasing, and recycling processes are well established. The ultimately reality is that every source of energy has an impact. Renewables are far superior to fossil fuels, but still have impacts. The only energy that doesn't have some negative impacts is the energy we do not use, which is why energy efficiency and conservation have to come first. So that was her answer. I hope it covered the two questions around that. And now we have a question for Lucy. And this is what it says. The transition we're about to undergo is at least 1.5 trillion per year. Public finance alone will not get us there, and in affordability crisis, any more taxes on the public could lead to social unrest. $130 trillion of private finance to 2050 was committed by GFANZ, but it's not written in stone. Private will need government policies to unleash that money. And the question is, are there any good examples of countries that have policies in the books to unleash that $130 trillion from private finance?
I would say the short answer is no. The strongest regulations that have been adopted so far come from countries with no strong financial sector. So they're not the ones which are gonna drive the money from the polluting sector to the transition. However, there are many obviously opportunities, especially at the EU level, that are being on the table right now. And there are many demands that NGOs are asking the regulation to take in place. I can mention one or two, but just as a reminder, indeed, the defense mentioned a big number last year during COP26 but that's just the overall amount of assets that are being represented by the GFANZ signatories. However, up to now, the GFANZ has been very reluctant to push its members to adopt very strict policies on fossil fuels, and they are very silent on the need to scale up financing and investment into renewable energies. So several things that needs to happen is obviously from the public side first. Public subsidies that Catherine talked about needs to be stopped, obviously, because these subsidies are making it like quite impossible for private financial institutions to say no to opportunities to finance very bad projects, polluting projects, maybe non-necessary projects, if these projects are being guaranteed by public financing. We need to remind that they remain private financial institutions, and because of the public subsidies to fossil fuels, these projects are being de-risked, and renewable energy on the other side are being seen as very risky by private and financial institutions. So we need to change the condition, and that's really like a regulatory piece. Secondly, obviously, a lot of things can be done, especially if by country, we are a bit radical. We will say that government could actually just forbid some kind of investment. But to be more diplomatic, we could think about the role that can play central banks, and especially the European central banks, by changing the monetary and prudential rules and requirements in order to disincentive financial institutions from financing the development of new fossil fuels, and on the contrary, to push them to do more financing to renewable energies, but also to other sectors of the transition that require investment. So that's really tools that can be put in place in order to really deter financial institutions from maintaining support to big corporation. And the third thing, obviously, it's more a fight against greenwashing. There are a lot of greenwashing going on in GFANZ around the net zero pledges, and we hope that the race to zero criteria will be followed up, or that the climate champions, the United Nations, will also follow up on what they are saying today, which is that if the signatories do not comply in a year's time with the new updated criteria and do not adopt a transition plan in a year, they might face exclusion. So we hope that they also to start doing so in order to not undermine for good the credibility of the whole alliance. Maria, you are in mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Lucy. And now, Olivier, a question for you. Have you looked at the synergies and trade-offs assessment between adaptation and mitigation in Working Group 2? It needs to be expanded upon, but helps point towards transitioning in the way of integrating mitigation, adaptation, and SDGs, especially with regards to CDR.
Yes, thank you indeed. I've seen that question, and that is a very good question indeed. And I think it's key to help finance projects that have both a component of mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And although this was not the focus of our analysis in our report, it's true that, for example, there's a lot of adaptation component that can be delivered through afforestation and reforestation, and which is a CDR technology that have a lot of sequestration potential. Although, if done appropriately, right? Because it can also stress local water resource if not done in the right place. It can also have some type of monocrops that is really bad for biodiversity. And then we also need to ensure sort of the longevity of this project in time to make sure that offsets that are purchased for forestry are not cut down or lost to forest fires in future years due to climate impacts. But so what we've done is actually considered the maximum of the sustainable potential of deployment of these technology, which is quite limited to, I think we're limited to 3.6 gigaton. And this is what the IPCC suggests that we can limit if we want to avoid the negative consequences associated with these with the CDR method. So yeah, so that needs to be definitely well thought through when delivering these projects in order to avoid a negative impact. But as we see globally, we can only use so much of these sequestration projects through a nature-based solution, and globally that leads to the need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions significantly, and that is done through phasing out fossil fuel and upscaling wind and solar technologies. So I mean, that's something we'd like to look at maybe in our upcoming report that will focus on other models and other scenario. And I think that we could potentially look at how can we sort of integrate the CDR critique that we have on in our assessment, and also see how can we actually improve the deployment of these afforestation and reforestation method to ensure that they have the maximum co-benefits for adaptation.
Thank you, Olivier. We have another question. It goes, with recent energy companies in the US against government policies, which breach contracts over the next 10 years, do you think the Paris Agreement can be achieved? I think this is somewhat related to the Energy Charter Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
We know, yeah, we know that the European Commission is pushing to change that treaty. Spain is saying that the European Union should leave the treaty altogether. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think that investment treaties and international state disputes settlement are indeed sort of a huge barrier to phasing out fossil fuel. And so that's why indeed there's a lot of hope put on the reform of the Energy Charter Treaty, and that countries need to definitely assess ways to amend, adapt, or even repeal this treaty if they are incompatible with achieving their own climate targets. So actually there's a lot of work being done at IISD on this front. And actually we had a webinar last week, I think, on this very topic. And this will also be a deep dive into our forthcoming report and analysis of a larger set of scenarios. So we plan to, we're gonna have Kayla Tinhara, who will write a chapter on this very issue and suggest way to amend, adapt, or repeal these treaty, but also we're going to look at the amount of embodied emissions that are protected by these treaties in the fossil fuel reserves, and see how much of a threat they pose, and what we can do in order to make sure that we can go beyond that barrier and find a way to prevent international state dispute settlement, to force government to pay really large sum of money that should go into the energy transition instead.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I mean, I was just going to say that we can potentially post also some links and resource on this when we follow through with the communication following this webinar. So we'll send you the slides, and also the recording will be available. We can also potentially add some resource on ISDS and
Thank you. One more question. Do you believe that drawdown is an effective mechanism for reductions?
Okay. I mean, I would ask for maybe some elaboration of the drawdown. Is it in the, do you know what Roger is referring to, Maria, or?
Roger, can you say more about that? I've opened up your mic if you want to elaborate a bit more. Thanks.
Sure, that is the Pachamama Alliance. that is working worldwide with the 100 solutions. And it seems that many of us can take individual actions so that we would eat a potato instead of an avocado, things like this, which have a very high carbon footprint. We eat less meat, we use our feet more, we turn our heat down, we insulate our homes, because government does not seem to be acting in the same urgency that most of us realize. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that clarification, Roger. And indeed, I mean, I'm familiar with the project drawdown, and indeed that points towards demand reduction, and this is something that was a significant highlight in the latest IPCC working group 3 report. So actually, one of the illustrative mitigation pathways that was highlighted in the report is the IMP-LD, so it's for low demand, and it shows that indeed there's plenty and countless ways that we can reduce demand by energy efficiency, changing modes of transport, and insulating homes, using heat pumps, and actually this is also some of the recommendation that the IEA submitted following the Ukraine crisis on how and also Amber and other consultancy suggested several ways in which Europe can reduce its demand on European gas in order to prevent any further imports of additional supply coming from Africa or from Canada. And so indeed, it's just a matter of assumption and how fast can we achieve these demand reduction globally in order to alleviate the requirement for oil and gas supply. But I am a big proponent of that, and they do show great potential in certain energy scenarios. And it's a matter of incentivizing these demand reduction methods. So I don't think we should put the onus too much on the consumer necessarily, but also the government needs to provide enabling environment for them to be able to reduce their consumption, and that requires investments and policy support.
Not much on the consumer side, oh dear.
Mm-hmm. Pardon me, was that a follow-up? I haven't heard your comment. Or perhaps can just move to another question. Or,
Yes.
I don't know. If there's still time, I think.
Yeah, it's a follow-up question from Roger. We have 5 more minutes. He says he's thinking how to encourage and implement rapid reductions.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, it's a matter of providing an enabling environment from government to provide alternatives for consumer to use. So, I mean, if they are rather some subsidy program for installation of heat pumps and replacement of bad insulation, providing other modes of transport, subsidizing clean transportation, public transportation. And yeah, so I think it's a matter of creating the right incentive in the public sphere, while also being well aware of the distribution of the impact it has on consumer. So not putting the onus on the poorest population, but actually having some progressive policies that ensure that not the poorest pays the highest bill for increasing fossil fuel tax, for example, but actually providing a set of enabling environment for other alternative to be more easily taken up by consumer.
Great, thank you, Olivier. Well, we've come to the end of the Q&A questions from the audience. We have 3 minutes left. And I have one final question for you, Olivier. How sensitive are oil and gas phase-out pathways to assumptions on CDR and CCS in energy transition models?
Right, sure, and I can quickly answer that. So actually, the short answer is very sensitive. We see from we work with different filtering methodology as we underwent this study, and we actually had an alternative pathways that we published in our annex of the report, which shows that when we impose more stringent criteria on the set of scenario that sort of filters for less use of CCS and CDR, and for a more conservative on this assumption, then actually the oil and gas production consumption decreases significantly faster, and so does the upscale of renewable energy. So yeah, we can see actually in the annex of the report that yeah, if we change these assumptions as we've done, and we have a smaller set of pathways, we have like 14 pathways instead of 26. We show a much faster level of oil and gas production. So this is why we decided to focus on this in our report, is to basically show that proponents of this technology are often arguing for delay in action for oil and gas production phase out. And here we see that in some industry scenarios, from Shell, for example, they show that with the huge deployment of BECCS in the second half of the century and significant amount of CCS, which basically allows them to produce even more.
CCS is carbon capture, where you get the net and go
yeah, exactly,
chasing the carbon atoms.
Yeah, so sorry for the acronyms here, but so using more carbon capture and storage in the fossil fuel sector allows, or could allow in some models, fossil fuel company to keep increasing their production until the 2030 and have higher production to 2030, which is mathematically very incompatible with what we see in the climate models from the IPCC. And yeah, the assumption for the deployment of this technology is actually quite overestimated, and we see that there's quite a lot of caveat under deployment, and so that's why we should follow, at the minimum, the IPCC feasibility assessment on the deployment of this technology as a minimum threshold, I think.
Thank you, Olivier. We have 2 minutes left, and I have one final question for Lucy. And I was wondering if there are any guidelines for developing countries to navigate finance and central bank reform to support renewables and stop fossil fuel financing, especially considering that many developing countries, and I come from Argentina, so are heavily indebted, and I've, you know, like facing like huge debt crisis. Thank you.
That's a big question. I will say in general, like if you're in a country where there is like financial institutions being active in financing companies operating locally, if you look, for example, at Brazil's company Eneva is mostly financed by banks in the country. So I just pick this example because I don't know all this situation, but I know that's the case of Brazil. And if obviously like that's the case in your country, you might be willing to campaign on these financial institutions. And in that case, the World Reclaim Finance team will be very happy to provide you with support about how navigating financial institutions, adapting demands to the different business line of financial institutions, considering you will not have the same demands for banks, investors, and insurers. So we have also a lot of tools that are available to assess the policy and to steer up the competitions between financial institutions, especially the coal policy tool, the oil and gas policy tool, etc. So that's clearly like just an invitation to just reach out to us if you want. The second thing is that obviously I mentioned fossil fuels because I would say that the first priority is obviously there will be priority to increase the investment into renewable energies, and in that case a lot of public financing and scheme to put in place to incentive financial institutions to finance that. But I will also mention that today priority is to prevent the development of new fossil fuel projects in this country. Usually these fossil fuel projects, there is a report being planned to be published during COP by Intergovernmental with a couple of other groups from Africa, and it's about the new oil and gas and coal projects being planned in Africa. And most of these projects are being driven by companies from outside for export, not for this country, but really for export, and that needs to be stopped. And there are several campaigns being like planned right now at the moment, so also reach out to us. So because the best way to stop a project is to work together. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is to say it's a very technical thing, but which we would love to discuss with you. There is a lot of discussion right now at the EU level about corporate reporting through norms that are being called CSRD and CSDD, and they are very key about asking companies, including financial institutions, to adopt transition plan. A transition plan that must take into account the impacts of their activities in the real world. So that's really key. I don't get into the detail, but it's really key. If we really want to change the business model of these companies, there is a big international fight behind this topic, which seems like only at the EU, because there is another discussion which at the international level, and a lot of countries, including countries from the South, will usually align with international norm, which is called IISD, which is pulled by IISD, which is completely opposed to the approach being followed in Europe, which is really about a risk approach and not about an impact approach. If we really want to prevent financial institutions and companies from developing projects in the South that do not make sense, we need you to also convince your countries to and your government to stand and align with what is being discussed at the EU level. And we can answer your questions if you want after this call.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. It's been certainly great to hear from our splendid speakers. Thank you, Lucie. Thank you, Olivier. Thank you, Catherine, who already left. And I'll see you soon in the next webinar sometime. Bye.
Thank you, Maya. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.